Thank you, and thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to come speak. It's a great opportunity to actually get out of Faculty of Health Sciences and go to where people are doing different stuff that I find very interesting. And I think, Joe, you picked the title human factor, which is kind of a global term to describe a lot of the stuff that we're fiddling with, both over in the Faculty of Health Sciences, and some other stuff that we're involved with that doesn't happen to take place at Mac. Can you guys hear me? Is it on? Am I on a PA or just on the camera? Okay. Am I speaking loud enough for everybody in the back, more or less? Okay. So what are we going to talk about? Human factor is a very general term, and sometimes a bit of a confusing term because it's used by engineers, it's used by psychologists, it's used by ergonomics people. The stuff that I'm going to talk about today is primarily related to teams and teams under stress, and what we tend to call high-performance teams. And I'm thirsty here, one sec. Healthcare is a new area we're actually looking at in terms of sort of formal approaches to teams and how they work. Most of our stuff comes from one or two disciplines. This is an International Space Station, a picture from a few years back. We worry a lot about how these guys function under stress, and I'm going to bounce around between fields. I'm going to talk about people and teams today, but I'm going to bounce around between the different domains and the different specific environments where we find these teams functioning. A lot of what we know, we look at from aviation, so we worry a lot about these guys in the front here. Anybody here a pilot? Any pilots? I love this picture because I spent about 6 or 7 years in the Canadian Air Force. And I worked with the fighter pilot community. And they're a great bunch of people. They're positive, full of life, can-do. And they tend to be very safe people. They tend to work very well in the cockpit. And the only way you can really distract them is by pulling out a camera. Because the only thing they like more than flying safely is actually having their picture taken flying safely. So somebody photoshopped this, and that's great fun. We also have unusual teams you may not think of as teams. We have fire jumpers, for example. These are the guys that parachute into big forest fires. Extremely dangerous work. They're all connected by radio. Sometimes it's in the dark like this, and they land all over the place, and it's really, really dangerous, and we worry a lot about their safety. We worry about them staying together and knowing where everybody is, and they have a very complicated job to do. Military is full of high-performance teams, especially commando teams. They're small, self-sufficient units that go out there and do pretty challenging jobs, and usually they do it pretty well, and they're very highly trained. And this is the South Pole. So this is one of the Antarctic research stations that the Australians run, and we've looked at these groups as well. We have larger communities here, maybe 15, 20 people, and we put a fair amount of work into looking how do we actually make these people work a little bit better than they would otherwise. And because this is a psychology talk, I'm going to go back to my psychology box models. And everybody will have seen at some point in their psychology career the input, process, output model, hopefully. And it's just a framework by which you can look at breaking something down and figuring out how you're going to study it. So when we look at teams, you can sort of look at what the inputs are to a team environment. And think back to fire jumpers, think to the cockpit, the astronauts up in space. What do we bring into that team environment? We bring the people themselves, their training, the kind of equipment they have, the environment in which they're functioning, ergonomics, organizational factors. That's a huge one at NASA. It's a big organization, has its way of doing things, and the way it does things actually have a big impact upon the crews up in space. When we actually look at the team process, we can talk about technical skill sets. We've historically looked at that in medicine. More recently now we're looking at what we call non-technical skill sets. How do they actually run an emergency? How do they deal with the problems that come up? How do they lead a team in a crisis? How do they follow if they're not the person in charge? External events can impact on how the team does things on a moment-to-moment basis. Malfunctions and errors are an area that we spent a lot of time in the last few years looking at. Good crews make mistakes. They make mistakes all the time. Probably everybody here has flown in a commercial aircraft carrier or airliner at some point. We know from observational data that we collected when I was down in Texas that the average flight has 1 or 2 mistakes on it every flight, and 1 or 2 off-normal events every flight. And the good crews just manage those things, and the good crews manage them as they would any other routine event. And when you look at team processes, you have multiple outputs. So the team produces something. It can be the flight from A to B, or it can be the mission up in space, or it can be the heart transplant for a surgical team. And they can do it well, and they can do it quickly, and they can do it efficiently. They can do it safely, which is a big objective for team output in things like space and aviation, and more recently, conceptually, in medicine. The team will learn things. So when you go through a complex process, if you're going to go off and do some adventure with your friends and go hiking or something, you will learn things from that experience that you bring with you the next time. It may change your attitudes, it may change your perspective. Those are all outputs that we consider when we look at teams. And these, when it comes to teams, these are iterative models, all right? So what you do with your team on a given day is what you bring in the next day. If you're an airline crew and you're on a 4-day mission, what you learn each day, the fatigue that builds up, the experiences you have, are things that you bring in the next day and the next day and the next day. So these tend to be cyclic models where they continually learn either in a positive or negative direction as to what's going on. The first thing I want to talk about is people. All right? People are a big part of what you bring into a team. And one of the questions, and this is a fundamental question, it's a really hard one to answer, are some people better at working in teams than others? Most people intuitively think so. Some people like it, some people don't like it. The more controversial question is, can we actually identify and select team members who have the right stuff to work in teams? And I'm going to talk about the right stuff. This is a term that goes way back to the 1960s, probably before then. And it really started with the selection of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. Some of you, if you're as old as me or older, you may remember a movie in the 1980s called The Right Stuff. It was an interpretation of Tom Wolfe's popular book of the same thing. And it really covered the selection and identification of what they thought were the best astronauts they could for the first missions of the U.S. space program. The conceptualization in those early years of what the right stuff was, were you wanted to find somebody you could stick in front of on the top of a rocket like this. Really dangerous, complex tasks. They wanted people who could remain calm, would perform well under pressure. They didn't know what they were going to expect. But that has changed in the last 20 or 30 years in the space world as we move towards longer duration flights. We move towards bigger crews. We're putting people up in this place. This is the International Space Station. We put them up there now for 6 months at a time. So the idea of who's better suited to that environment may be a fundamentally different question than who's best suited to go up for 24 hours on a Mercury capsule in the 1960s. A lot of thinking right now about going back to the moon. That's a current plan. It may change. It changes every few years. But the current mission plans for going back to the moon are crews of anywhere from 3 to 6 people and lasting anywhere from 7 to 90 days. It's a dangerous environment. People are stuck there for a long time. Medical care is hard to come by. You've got to like your neighbors because you're living in something about the size of Winnebago. You're breathing the same air. You're drinking each other's reprocessed urine. It's not necessarily the optimal place to be. We look at analogs on Earth for this stuff. So how do we send crews down to places like this? This is Concordia Station on the South Pole. It's a research station run by the French and Italian governments, but the Australians have stations down there, the British have stations, the Americans have stations. And these stations basically function autonomously over about an 8-month period, primarily in the darkness. And selecting and training the crews for these places is a real challenge. And a lot of this stuff is all aimed towards Mars. So if you look at what NASA's long-term plans are, either publicly stated or not stated, everybody kind of wants to go back to Mars. And I don't have a slide for it, but if you look at the orbital dynamics, you look at the way the orbits line up for Mars, you're looking around 6 months to get there, 3 years on the surface, and about 6 months to get back. So the current mission timelines are 3 to 5 year timelines, again, about 5 people, all living in a space a lot smaller than this room, probably from different countries, different genders, different value systems. And sometimes people say, well, does it really matter as long as you're trained for the job? But think of the 5 or 6 people who you have found most irritating in your life. Actually, I had a whole pile of pictures. I was going to stick them in, but I didn't. I thought it was rude. But think of that guy in college who used to drink too much, and you always kind of find him on the floor of your dorm on Saturday mornings. The person who used to beat you up in public school. You can find lots of people in life that are actually hard to get along with. If you stuck them all in there for 6 months, or for 6 years, you're kind of looking at what the worst case scenario is for going to Mars. And from a psychology perspective, you could kind of describe the current plan for the Mars mission as the most stressful social psychology experiment you could possibly imagine to try and evoke maladaptive behavior out of people. Because from that perspective, it's a pretty horrible experience, I think. But when we talk about selections, we're talking about finding people. And this is everything from long-duration space teams to fire crews to airline pilots. When we say we want to find the right people, what are we looking at? We're looking at really the field of individual differences, which has kind of fallen in and out of favor over the last 30 years, if you look at it. Some stuff's very easy to measure and easy to identify. Other stuff is a lot more complex. So intelligence, you may want to select on that. You may want to look at experience. That's a big one right now for the astronaut corps. You certainly don't want somebody flying your 747 who's not experienced at flying a 747. They have job-specific knowledge, so you may want to select that. We do think that people have different aptitudes. So some people are good with electronics. They're good with their hands. If you're going to send somebody up on the space station, you want somebody who can fix things and is good at fixing things. And one of the big ones that we're going to talk about is personality, which is really the idea of who you are as a person. When you talk about personality, you can talk about really two different approaches to it. You can have dynamic or motivational models, and you can have static or trait-specific models. So motivational models are, my dad was a really nasty guy, so now I don't like my boss because he reminds me of my father and he evokes these emotional responses from me. Sort of the Freudian dynamic models that we're kind of used to. And the static or trait-based models are much more individual characteristics that we think are stable over time. Both are probably meaningful and appropriate ways to look at people, and it's a question of what you want to measure and what you want to predict. The dominant model right now in trait psychology, some of you will have had exposure to this. It's not the only model, but it's probably the most dominant one. It's emerging really from factor analysis of previous existing models. But it's the idea of somebody being sort of graded upon a 5-parameter construct. Neuroticism versus emotional stability, or extroversion versus introversion. Openness or closed to new experiences. Agreeableness versus hostility. These are bipolar scales. And conscientiousness versus laziness. We like this model because it's pretty robust. So if I measure you on a given tool, and I go back in 2 years and I measure you, you're probably going to come out somewhere about the same. If I think that you look kind of lazy on the thing, I can go to your friends and I can ask you if you're lazy. Or ask your friends if they're lazy. I can ask your teachers if you're lazy. If you're a hard worker, your teachers probably think you're a good hard worker, and your friends probably think you're a hard worker. If you're funny and friendly, then everybody thinks you're funny and friendly. So these things are pretty stable over time. We know they have some modest predictive ability. Most of it's related to work, and most of it's conscientiousness. We know that it's a pretty universal model, so it emerges really from studies in multiple countries. There are some cross-cultural issues about it, but it's pretty much perceived as a universally valid approach to personality. We know that some of it's inherited, which some people don't like because it sounds like eugenics. But if you look at animal models, we certainly have no qualms about thinking that hostile dogs probably have hostile puppies, and friendly dogs probably have friendly puppies, and that pit bulls are more likely to bite you than golden retrievers, and all these things. And we recognize that it's a blunt model. You can actually talk about people, even in trait models, down to much more specific levels. I want to talk about 3 of these things specifically, because we think these are the ones that probably have impact, especially in closed, confined living, but maybe also in other job environments as well. So neuroticism is sort of the idea of being phobic, or easily excited, easily aroused, versus being calm and emotionally stable. So if you look historically at people like test pilots, these guys are unflappable, right? You'll put them in an airplane, you'll give them an engine failure, and they'll crash into the mountain, and as their plane's going down and they know they're going to die, they read out a stream of data because they think it's probably a fairly useful thing to give out before they die. They're sort of on the far, far end of what we consider to be sort of calm and stable people. Agreeableness, which is another pretty universally acknowledged trait. How friendly is somebody versus how aggressive are they? How dominant are they? How easy are they to get along with? And the one that probably is most predictive is conscientiousness, and that's how hard is somebody as a worker? How neat are they? Are they organized in how they do things? Or they tend to kind of slough a lot of this stuff off. You can certainly go to other models of personality. You can look at subtraits like empathy or narcissism or honesty or altruism. These are much more specific, and if you look at some of the research, people actually try to get at these things much more precisely than you would with a global blunt model like the Big Five. So what is the right stuff? You often see pictures of this guy when you hear the right stuff, and this is Gordon Cooper. He's one of the first Mercury astronauts. By all accounts, a great guy, really, really, really good pilot, funny. Everybody liked him. But in more common and more recent conceptualizations, you think of this kind of thing. This is the US Airways flight that went down in the Hudson River a few months ago. And the crew that flew this is generally acknowledged as the kind of crew that you want to have flying your airplane if you hit a bunch of Canada geese at 800 feet, right? You want these people who stay calm. They do a really good job of organizing themselves. They don't panic. They don't get task-focused. They don't get overly critical. They don't give up. By all accounts, the behavior in the cockpit was excellent. Everybody was very focused. The flight attendants in the back did a wonderful job of organizing people. And the question is, how do you get this? Is this selected? Is this natural? Is it trained? Because we can find lots of examples of, that's Captain Sullyberger. You see him on interviews on TV. He seems like a great guy. Everybody seems to like him. He seems to be a competent pilot. And the first thing he says is, I had a great crew and I really like my crew. It's kind of who you want flying. And the the right stuff, if you conceptualize it in terms of the big five, are sort of a combination of agreeableness or social orientation, people who are good at teams, and conscientiousness, people who are really, they know their stuff. They work hard to do their stuff. They're task-focused. They've read their manuals. They know what's going on. In terms of, I did my PhD with a guy named Bob Helmrich, who some of you may or may not know. But he characterized this really in terms of instrumentality and expressivity, which is just really a different way of saying the same thing. And sometimes you find it in the team literature as sort of somebody who's team and task-oriented. The wrong stuff is this kind of guy, right? And it's great that he's sort of on a TV show, right? And if you see interviews with Hugh Laurie, he's obviously a great guy. He's a pretty funny guy, a good British comedian who just pretends to be American for the show. But his character, House, is sort of the prototype of the unprofessional physician, right? Really good diagnostician, knows all of his stuff, treats people like crap, is arrogant, narcissistic, unempathetic, and very, very difficult to work with. To some extent, the conceptualization of this kind of individual goes back to the idea of masculinity and femininity being a bipolar construct. And the guy I did my PhD with, Bob Helmrich, really did a lot to kind of thrash that stuff out in the 80s. But you often hear people say, oh, you know, he or she is a very aggressive individual, but they really know their stuff. They're a really good neurosurgeon, or they're a really good pilot, or whatever. When we look at teams, we start to reconceptualize this, saying it doesn't really matter how competent they are. If they're aggressive and hard to work with, they probably actually have a very poor team structure around them. In the airline industry, we have a thing called negative bidding. So first officers can choose not to fly with certain pilots. So when they put a request in for their schedule, they'd like to fly to Maui a few times next month, and they want to fly to Egypt a couple of times, and they want to do some local routes. They can actually specify in some of these computer programs who they don't want to fly with. So you can spot the aggressive, difficult to work with individuals, or the highly unconscientious, disorganized individuals, by the number of people who refuse to fly with them after they've flown with them once. So it's sort of like a in situ workplace personality assessment. And we would describe these people as sort of being low on agreeableness, or alternatively high on hostility, but also being high in conscientiousness. They actually do a good job if it's sort of a sole task, or if they can kind of coax people into working with them. But you can sort of think of them as driven but nasty. Then you have this guy. So the guy I did my PhD with used to describe the right stuff, wrong stuff, but you also get no stuff people, right? So these are people who are just kind of like Homer, and sometimes they can be friendly, and sometimes they're not, but they generally are not really the kind of people you want to have floating around in your cockpit when there's a disaster. There's a pretty good body of research that says if you look at sort of that right stuff combination of characteristics, you get superior performance in these highly operational settings. So airline pilots, we see actually the pilots that are socially oriented, the ones who score high on things like expressivity and social orientation and agreeableness. If you give them a training course that talks about teamwork and how to run a cockpit, they come out and they go, that was a great course. I'm going to do some of this stuff next time I go flying. And if you look at people who rate really high on things like hostility and interpersonal aggressiveness, they hate the course. They hate being told they have to work better in a group. And they actually respond negatively to these training scenarios, and we think they actually come out poorer team players afterwards because it's so ego-dystonic for who they are. Antarctic stations, there's some pretty good data from both the Norwegian and the Australian and now the American stations that a lot of these factors have implications for cohabitability in isolation and confinement. Submarine crews have shown the same pattern, and somebody in my advisor's lab about 10 years before I was there looked at bank loan officers. And interesting, people who are high on drive and conscientiousness and work orientation, and they're socially competent and interpersonally sensitive, do really well as loan officers, but they leave after 6 months because it's a bit of a frustrating, boring job, and they actually have career aspirations. So the best people for the job may actually not be the ones you want to select because they don't stick around. There are a couple of exceptions. Okay? My Norwegian friend did a study on the Norwegian Special Forces, and these guys tend to be really high on conscientiousness and drive, but fairly low on social expressivity and agreeableness, which kind of fits because your average sniper is probably not overly socially oriented. And then I was looking for pictures on the net, and I found this one. And these are French snipers from France. So not all snipers are sort of antisocial and loners. Although if you look at him, he doesn't look really happy with his position. So if you break this down in terms of the big five, what do we think the right stuff is? We think they're people who are highly conscientious, they're easy to get along with, and they don't get excited. And it's so intuitively satisfying that if you can actually identify these individuals, it makes sense. That this is kind of, if you go back to your Captain Sullyburger, this is kind of who you want to do it, right? This is the person who, they know their job, and they're a good team leader, and they don't get excited. Let's go back to this model. This is my input process output model. And I want to talk about training, because we did have an expression in the CRM world. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the crew training world, which is the secret to good crew training, is selection, selection, selection. If you have really good pilots, it's a piece of cake. If you have somebody who's hostile and doesn't like you, it's a real nightmare. But you get what you get. And we have people who go into medicine who are great and some who aren't. We have people who go into aviation who are great and some aren't. We have people who get into the astronaut corps who are great and some aren't. So how do you take the mix of people that you have and actually try and train them? We know the good teams have these 4 dominant characteristics. They tend to do what they do and they do it well. They actually tend to do it more efficiently than other teams. If something changes, the team doesn't stay static. They can actually react to it. And they can actually adapt what they're doing to produce a better outcome. And the U.S. Airways jet that went down in the Hudson River is a perfect example. By all accounts, a really good pilot, a really good co-pilot, really good flight attendants, and they did a good job. Something happened that was really out of the ordinary and really extreme, and they reacted and they actually pulled it out of the fire. So we often look to the aviation crew training and say, is this the gold standard for team training and how we actually want to get our people to work under stress? That's just a picture of these guys again. But if you look at aviation safety has a long, inglorious history of being unsafe. So you can go back to certainly the early days of aviation, and the attrition rate in places like the First World War, just in flight training, was worse than in combat. More people died trying to fly the airplane than they actually did when they flew it into battle. I'm going to talk about, let me check my time here. I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 airplane crashes. Some go back a few years, and some are more recent. Because some people will say that the history of aviation safety is written in blood. We have a lot of data from a lot of crashes and a lot of good investigations where people tried to thrash out what went wrong each time. So this is the Florida Everglades, and it's the crash site of this flight here. I think I've got a little laser beam here. Yeah. So this is a flight back in 1972. It's an Eastern Airlines TriStar. Eastern Airlines is no longer around. And the TriStar is no longer around. But this goes back about 35 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. And this is a flight that was coming down from New York City to Miami late at night. It had been a long crew day. They're all kind of tired. And most airplane crashes start with that story. So they're coming down, and they're almost down on the ground. They're down to about 500 feet, and they can't get the gear to signal that they're down and locked, which is a very bad thing when you're landing. So they did exactly what they were supposed to do. They abandoned the approach. They went back up to what we call circuit altitude, so they're at 2,000 feet. And they enter the circuit, and they're flying around in a big oval trying to solve the problem. And when they do their turn, they put the autopilot on, and they start looking at this burned out light bulb, or this light bulb that's not coming on. And they're trying to figure out what's going wrong and why aren't they getting the light they need to land. And somewhere around halfway back through the circuit, something happens, and the plane just starts to sink, and it sinks, and it sinks. This is at night, remember. And it hits the swamp doing 180 knots, ironically with all 3 gear down and locked. And this is what we used to call in the Air Force a CFIT, or a controlled flight into terrain. So the airplane is flying along. The crew is perfectly competent. They've done exactly what they're supposed to do. They're flying on autopilot, and they all end up dead. And almost everybody died in this crash. And what happened, when you look at the cockpit voice recorder and you look at the crash wreckage, basically everybody in the cockpit was looking down. All 3 of the people in the cockpit were looking down trying to solve this problem. The autopilot becomes disengaged. Nobody's looking out the window. And everybody died as a result of it. Another crash that we often talk about in terms of aviation safety, this is Tenerife in the late 1970s. This was a crash where 2 747s collided on the runway at the secondary airport in the Tenerife Islands, or in Tenerife, in the Canary Islands. The story, and it's a long story, and whenever I talk about these kinds of accidents, you never do them justice because they're very complex things. And you can spend a graduate seminar looking at crashes like this and really dissecting it. And people spend 2, 3, 4 years. This crash happened around 1977, I think it was, 76 or 77. And you still find debate in the literature as people go through the cockpit voice recorder and they go through the transcripts really trying to figure out why it happened the way it did. But the short summary of this story is the Canary Islands are a big vacation destination. So you have a whole pile of 747s going there every day with vacationers from around the world. And on this day, the weather was not great, and there was a bomb threat at the main airport. So all the airplanes were diverted to the northern airport, and they sat there on the ground for a number of hours waiting for the bomb threat to clear, which it did, and the fog to clear, which it was slowly doing. They started moving the airplanes around and getting them ready to take off because the weather was getting better. And the KLM 747, which was sitting at the button of the runway ready to take off, started to do a takeoff roll. And there was some confusion about whether or not they thought they had clearance. They didn't actually have clearance. They may or may not have had proper clearance, but they had actually ambiguous clearance from the tower. There was confusion in the cockpit about whether or not they should be taking off, so the first officer was not all that comfortable. And the captain made the executive decision to take off. That's been criticized, but it's also complex. And about halfway down the runway sees in the fog the Pan Am 747 crossing the runway, which had been cleared to cross the runway. Nothing scares a commercial pilot more, I think, than having to cross an active runway to get from A to B, because it's an inherently dangerous thing. So the KLM jet tried to take off. It tried to pull up in the air, didn't have enough speed, and it sheared the top off the 747. Both ended up splattering all over the field, and around 570-some people died. Still probably the worst accident in aviation. I mean, certainly 9/11 claimed a lot of lives, but it wasn't an accident. But in terms of team and process accidents, this is the worst we've ever had. And then a few years later, this is 1979, so these all go back to the 1970s, and that's important. This is a United Airlines flight flying into Portland, Oregon, and think about the first story I just told you. This is a plane coming into land, and it gets a gear warning light. And it pulls up in the air, and it flies around for 45 minutes at several thousand feet as the crew tries to solve the gear warning light problem. They don't want to land without gear down, right? And what happens is as they're sitting there going through the manuals and checking the circuits, and they actually went back in the aircraft, and they looked out the wing, and they could see the little pin sticking up, which told them the gear was down, but they still weren't too convinced because the light wasn't indicating properly. And they ran out of gas, which is awful in aviation because you should never actually run out of gas. There should always be something to keep you from doing that. And they landed. It's a controlled landing in the trees. Bit of a funny twist to this story is that they were trying to find people after the accident. They figured there must be bodies scattered throughout the trees because they couldn't identify everybody. But it happened in the suburbs outside of Portland, and some people walked home from the accident. So, I kid you not. And actually, I presented this slide a few years ago. I was talking about aviation safety, and a woman in the audience said, I was on that flight. And she remembers the co-pilot coming down and looking out the window. So always helps remember these are real people when you talk about the accident. Sometimes I forget. And this is more recent. This is Garuda Indonesia Airlines about 2 years ago. And this is a jet that was coming in for a landing going way, way, way too fast, about 200 kilometers an hour too fast, or 100 kilometers an hour too fast. And the analysis of the cockpit voice recorder showed that the pilot had ignored 15 warnings on the way down and refused to acknowledge the concerns of the first officer, who thought they were going way too fast and were out of control. And this individual here is now in jail for manslaughter because of reckless behavior. So you think back to right stuff, wrong stuff, no stuff. Some of these accidents are really good crews getting caught by a complex system. Some are maybe questionable judgments by crews that are pretty good, and some of it is outright undesirable behavior. So we see the whole spectrum. If we look at data, and some of this, you can have another hour-long seminar just discussing this one graph. But what are the causal contributors to airline accidents? Is it regulatory? Is it the weather? Is it a failure of the engineering of the aircraft? Is it a maintenance issue? We see all these things. But almost every single accident that happens, the bottom line here is flight crew. Almost every single accident, the flight crew is cited as part of the causal contribution to the accident. You can argue this is attribution error, because whenever we look at complex things, we say, well, there are people in the front and they must have screwed up. If only somebody had said something at the key moment, it wouldn't have happened. If only they'd landed without worrying about that light, they wouldn't have crashed. This kind of research is full of hindsight bias. It's full of all of your cognitive biases as you're trying to figure out what went wrong. But people do their best, and you've got to analyze it anyway. But the general consensus is that the flight crew is generally a big contributor to why things go wrong. And what spawned that, and the pictures I showed you, most of those are from the 1970s, because what those specific accidents and a few others led to was the whole idea that we could start training our crews to be safer. We already knew they were good pilots. We knew they all know their weather. They know their stick and rudder. They know how to navigate. But usually when you look at the dysfunction in the cockpit in the moments before the crash, the general consensus that most of us have is that more highly functioning crews probably could have avoided that accident. Again, it's a risky thing to say that, but that I think is a pretty safe thing to say. So we developed a thing called crew or cockpit resource management training. And what this is really getting crews to think that safety is sort of the superordinate goal of flying. It's not getting there on time. It's not having a smooth flight. It's not getting a good meal halfway through the flight. It's you want to get there, and you want to get there as safe as you can. And we give them basic education in human factors. That's fatigue, cognitive fixation errors, these kinds of things. We bring in concepts like cross-monitoring. If you're having two people do something, if you're having one person do something, it makes a lot more sense to double-check that every time if it's a safety-critical issue. One of the big ones has been removing barriers to communication, especially hierarchy and authority. So you want a cockpit where the first officer says, "I'm uncomfortable with this," and you want a captain who says, "I thought it was okay, but you're saying you're uncomfortable. Let's resolve this. Let's not just kind of barrel along." That's a huge one. Knowing that people get defensive in a crisis and they get a bit argumentative sometimes because they're frightened. Improving the overall function of the team and the coordination of the team. Clarifying roles and responsibilities. Often when we see an accident, especially in medicine, but in other areas as well, there's confusion about who should be doing what. And the good teams seem to know who should be doing what all the time. And probably the biggest one is this thing called a shared mental model. And a shared mental model is sort of the concept that everybody in the crew should really know the big picture. Because as soon as you know what you're doing, but the person next to you doesn't, you're on your own and they're basically watching you do it. We use simulation a lot in aviation. So this is a Airbus simulator. It's an older one, but it's an Airbus. And it's a snippet of two young pilots being trained and a more senior pilot giving them briefings. And a lot of the briefings that they get after they do a simulated flight are all related to human factors and how you command and control your crew. And this is pretty standard at any big airline, is this whole raft of these high-fidelity simulators. We use them a lot for a lot of the technical training, but also what we call the non-technical skills training, the team training. And the specific elements that are really important for CRM are things like clear closed-loop communication. So we do some of that in healthcare. So if I'm going to read out a drug dose or an altitude setting, I want somebody to read it back to me, and I want to make sure we know the numbers right. The person in charge really has a responsibility for setting the climate and the sense of how things should run in the cockpit. And the good pilots and the good surgeons and the good anesthetists do this. The expectation that people around you should question what's going on. I mean, we did a lot of observations in the cockpit when I was down in the lab in Texas, and you just see the whole range of experience. Sometimes you'll hear the pilot say to a very junior pilot, "Let me give you a few words of advice. Keep your mouth shut, keep your hands off the stick, and try and learn something." And if you heard that, you kind of like, "Oh, this is going to be a bad flight." And the really good ones is when the pilot would turn around to me as sort of the doctor psychology guy and say, "Well, you've got two sets of eyes. If you see anything out of the ordinary, don't be afraid to bring it up as we fly along." You thought, "Oh, this guy's really on top of it." And by all accounts, that's kind of your Captain Sullyburger guy, right? The idea that anything you're going to do, you should give a quick briefing to people. If you're going to land and it's kind of an unusual landing, let your co-pilot know exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. Same with the OR, same with any of these things. So the idea of shared mental model, conflict resolution, that's a big one, right? So it's amazing how often when you look at a cockpit voice recorder, or if you're in the OR and something goes wrong, how often it's preceded by sort of bickering back and forth. And again, the idea of cross-checking. I think I have a clip here. Hopefully this will activate it. So this is an example of, no. Do you have any idea how I can activate a movie? I have a mouse. Okay. There. So usually everybody knows that's a joke, but sometimes when you talk to people, you have to point out it's supposed to be a joke. And it's not really a good way to do a conflict resolution. And we worry about the same stuff in the OR. So a lot of the issues that we've identified in aviation over the years, conflict resolution and human factors mistakes, data entry errors, people being very uncomfortable with not speaking up, that's probably the biggest one we see in healthcare. These are all things that when we look at aviation, we say, we've seen these things before, and is there a role for this kind of training in healthcare? Medical error is a huge issue right now. So I think I got this from the National Enquirer. And it's in Germany, actually. So it's not in North America. So the idea of, it's a bit of a joke on this slide, but the idea of poorly coordinated teams in healthcare, it's a huge issue. Sometimes it's called interprofessional care, sometimes it's called team dynamics, sometimes it's called CRM, but we know that healthcare is just rife with stories of dysfunctional behavior in the OR, arguing, people being cut off, somebody saying, "I think we should do something," and being yelled at, and they don't say anything again. There are stories on the books of people doing surgery on the wrong side of the brain, and the resident being so intimidated they don't say anything. because they're terrified about their career and they've been yelled at 3 times previously in the last hour. So lots of this stuff. We asked a question. We surveyed a whole pile of physicians. This is down in the States. Because we're trying to get the idea of team structure in the OR. And we said, in the operating room, we tried to be as clear as we could with the question so there's no ambiguity. In the operating room, the surgeon is ultimately responsible for the well-being of the patient. And we asked the surgeons, and they all said yes. And then we asked the anesthesiologists, and they all disagreed completely. So we thought, well, maybe it's an order effect, and maybe the anesthesiologist realized that it's a shared control model or something. So we reversed the question and said, in the operating, the anesthesiologist, MD, because they have nurse anesthetists, is ultimately responsible for the well-being of the patient. And a huge chunk of the anesthesiologists said, yep, that's right. All the surgeons said, no, that's absolutely wrong. And you can joke about this, and to some extent, it's situational leadership, right? Depending on what the situation is, different people take charge. But there are just endless anecdotes about arguing in the OR, and if you've gone through a residency or an internship in medicine, you've just seen this happen 100 times, people bickering about who's actually in charge of things. Very, very common. So we're starting to do this kind of stuff. This is just across the way here. This is our simulated operating room. We've had this for a couple of years now, and we're using it more and more. But I'll show you the kind of stuff. Here's a very, very quick little movie clip. This is not a joke. And this is an example of the kind of, a very short clip of the kind of training that we do there. And that's actually one of our residents who's now on faculty, and she did such a great job. I said, do you mind if I just keep this clip and show it to people? So it's an example of really how to run a top-down directive emergency in a very open, communicative way. But we try to simulate this stuff because we know that so much of this stuff is situational. It's situationally learned and it's situationally applied. And that sitting around a table talking about good ways to run a group is probably not an effective way to do it. And we just have a sense, and the data is emerging, that the more closely you can replicate the environment, probably the better the training sticks. And our friend Jeff Norman in the back there will probably tell you that a lot of learning is very situationally dependent. If people learn things in situations, it's better than sort of being an abstract concept. People are not good, especially under stress, at applying broad concepts of how you should run a team. That they basically fall back to learned patterns of behavior. So we try to make all this stuff as situationally relevant as possible. Do you agree with that, Jeff? Okay. So here's an example of the kind of stuff that we're trying to do now. So some of you may have seen in the press this summer we were up in the Arctic. So we dragged our simulator up to Devon Island. This was a Canadian Space Agency funded project. This is probably relevant to a bunch of people, but the Canadian Space Agency and all the space agencies actually are pretty worried about how they're going to deliver medical care on the station, and then on the moon, and then on Mars. There are equipment issues, there are personnel training issues, there are radio and signal delay issues. So one of the things we want to look at is to what extent can we use an analog up in the Arctic to tackle some of these team-based issues in terms of medical care delivery. So there's an area up there called the Houghton Impact Crater. It's a geologic remnant of an impact crater on Devon Island. You get to fly up there and you see all this wonderful scenery. Fantastic place. But there's a station there called the Houghton Mars Project Research Station. It's run by NASA and CSA, and they do rover testing and in situ resource utilization. They do communication networks, because it's kind of a radio empty zone. There are no radio waves or anything up there because it's so remote. The geology is an impact crater, so it's pretty close to the moon and Mars. So they do a fair amount of stuff with robotic rovers and autonomous control rovers and these things. There's a medical tent up there that's run by the CSA, the Canadian Space Agency. And when you're up there, you live in these little tents. But this is a picture, I think this is one of the pictures that was floated around this summer, but this is us setting up the mannequin for a trauma simulation. And this is actually a pretty realistic problem up there. They've had some issues with people rolling over all-terrain vehicles and breaking their necks. But there are twin otters that land on the rocky surface, and certainly a crash on landing is a very realistic prospect up there. And if you crash on landing, you end up looking something like this guy, and you don't really have any easy access to medical care. If there's a physician there, you're lucky. This year we had a physician's assistant up there, but for the first 3 weeks of the summer, there was no physician up there, and then we kind of came up with our stuff. So we were really looking at frontline station personnel and how they could manage fairly complex things. We set up a telemedicine link. It's a little hard to see here because of the brightness, but you can see up here this is a computer scientist, actually 2 computer scientists in this simulation. And this is Dr. Greg Peachy, one of our anesthesiologists down here at Mac. And we would set up these scenarios really as proof of concept, looking at whether or not we could replicate it, whether or not we could actually set up the communication network. and whether or not we could actually look at things like time delay and signal delay, which are important for the moon, and how that impacts our ability to supervise some things. And we would bounce our signal off the Anik satellite. They had a pretty good satellite uplink there. And we ran a whole series of these things. And I think I have a film clip here. Yeah, so this is about a 2-minute film clip of just one of our simulations. You see some scenery stuff here. But you'll see two people who have no advanced medical training whatsoever, but they're very competent individuals, being supervised through a trauma resuscitation by somebody 3,000 miles away. And that's in July, so it's a... And you can see down here, this is the image that the person is seeing from down here at Mac, with the ever-expanding pool of blood. So that's just a sample. We ran a whole series of these things. Some were trauma, some were heart attacks. But they're the kind of things that actually would go wrong up there. And from the Canadian Space Agency's point of view and the space program in general, they have fundamental questions like, what is the skill set that you need on the front line? How much do we need to train our astronauts to be able to handle this kind of event? Most mission scenarios to the moon and Mars include a physician, but you've sort of got a 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 chance that if you have a trauma, it's going to be to the physician. So there goes your expertise. Which is but it's a real consideration, right? Everybody says, oh, you need to have a doctor if you go to Mars for 4 years. But there's a good chance that if you have an explosion or you have a decompression or you have something like gallstones that come up, that's the individual that's going to be affected, and suddenly you lose your one person. So you need somebody at least secondarily trained. So this experimental setup allows us to actually test those skill sets. So we would give, that guy's a mechanic, the young lady is a computer scientist and a multimedia person. The previous scenario that you saw, the picture of, were 2 computer scientists. So in some ways, they're a very analogous population to the astronaut population. They're very competent individuals. We would give them about a 45-minute skills training session, which is realistically what somebody would probably be getting if they weren't the crew medical officer. And then you can actually trial your skill set, and you can trial your field medical kit and see, does this actually allow us to do what we want? And it's a new way of looking at managing emergencies, because we don't normally take the physician out of the picture and have them manage it through a TV set and a camera. So what you really have is you have people on the front end with their hands doing the stuff, and sort of to some extent the brains 3,000 miles away making decisions about fluids and drugs and management and all these things. And it's amazing how much we learn, but it's also amazing how much the things that we learned actually fit with what we'd found in other areas. One of the keys is that there's a big difference between groups and teams. This keeps popping up all the time. So if you have an unstructured gaggle of people look for teamwork, but you don't really see it. Sometimes you get spontaneous emergent cooperation, but teams tend to be structured and they tend to be highly functional. And so if you think about the cockpit and the crashes that you've just seen, but you also think, say, of the telemedicine scenario you just saw, clear roles, open lines of communication, shared mental models, learning from mistakes as you go along, and you do these things over and over again. That includes using things like simulation to practice it. And reevaluate. This is what the really good people do. They reevaluate their plan all the time. So good pilots reevaluate what they're doing every 20 or 30 minutes. Good crews reevaluate it. Good surgical teams will lift their heads up after 2 hours saying, this seems to be going longer than it usually does. Are we still good? Has the patient been asleep too long? Are they getting cold? Are we in a little bit deeper than we expected? Do we need to reschedule things? Do we need more blood products? So one of the real keys that the good teams do, and this I think is emerging more in the aviation literature because it's probably where the really good thinking is right now, is that the really good teams are adaptive. They're adaptive and they're reflective. They just keep reassessing, and they continually fine-tune and steer their direction on a regular, intermittent basis. The challenge in all this stuff is that a lot of things I'm talking about are theoretical models, the shared mental model, communication styles. How you take that from very theoretical stuff and you make it concrete is a huge challenge. So you can look at the telemedicine stuff, and we know things like shared mental models are good, and briefings are good, and collecting data is good. And you look at the telemedicine scenario and you think, what on earth does that mean in that environment? Or you go from aviation crews to submarine crews, and you go, well, we know that these briefings and these things we do in aviation are probably good, but how often should we do them, say, in the OR? That's a big question right now. So if you look at OR teams, and we look at aviation models, we think they should be briefing things, and they should be reevaluating things, and they should be communicating what they're going to do next. But to whom, and in what detail? I mean, you don't want the surgeon giving everybody a 2-hour lecture at the start of the case on exactly why they're doing what they're going to do, or why they prefer Ethelon sutures over Vicryl sutures. But they need to communicate a big picture to everybody else in the room so that everybody else can stay on the same page. And that seems to be the challenge. So that what you see a lot of failed attempts at are trying to translate these theoretical models of team training to operational environments. And that's where we all kind of stumble right now. I'm going to stop there because I think I'm at 3:20 right now, exactly. But just to let you know, if you're interested in some of this stuff, especially the space stuff, I'm scheduled to give a talk on January 19th over in the Ewart Angus Center on specifically space issues as part of Dave Williams' public lecture space medicine series. So we'll be looking at things like occurrence of depression in space and what we do about crew conflict, separating out sort of the social aspects of long-duration crews with the training aspects and where those merge and where they're actually different, and probably a bit more on selection and what's been looked at in selection with the astronaut corps and where we're going. So if you're interested in that stuff, you might want to jot that down, and it'd be great to see you there. But I'm going to end it there, and I think we have probably time for questions.